In the storm-battered coastal city of Seaforth Bay, a widowed father clutching his grandfather's toolbox was about to climb onto a billionaire's mansion roof. What started as an emergency repair call took a shocking turn when he came face to face with the most isolated woman in Maine. Daniel Reyes wasn't your typical handyman. For 2 years since his wife's death, he had spent his life keeping broken medical equipment running in rural hospitals, known for refusing payment from those who couldn't afford it. When he encountered Dr. Alexandra Pierce watching him work through rain-lashed library windows, he had no idea he was walking into a connection that would heal 2 shattered hearts. Daniel's simple act of kindness, refusing to overcharge during the storm, would lead to a love story worth $150 million. What began as fixing roof tiles would become rebuilding 2 lives. The Pierce medical empire would never be the same after a storm brought together a humble repair shop owner and a reclusive cardiac surgeon who had forgotten how to live. The weathered red toolbox that started it all still sits in their kitchen, a reminder that sometimes the most valuable repairs happen to hearts, not machines. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered red toolbox sat on Daniel Reyes's kitchen counter like a faithful companion, its dented surface bearing witness to 3 generations of honest work. His grandfather had carried it through the Great Depression, his father through the post-war boom, and now Daniel hefted its familiar weight each morning before heading out to fix whatever needed fixing in the small coastal city of Seaforth Bay. "Dad, you forgot to put jam on my toast," Sophia announced from the breakfast table, her auburn pigtails catching the morning light that streamed through their modest cottage's east-facing window. At 10 years old, she possessed her mother's keen eye for detail and her father's gentle persistence. "Mine too," Leo chimed in, though he was more focused on arranging his scrambled eggs into perfect lines across his plate. Where Sophia was all energy and observation, 8-year-old Leo moved through the world with careful deliberation, every action measured and thoughtful. Daniel smiled as he retrieved the strawberry jam from the refrigerator, Elena's homemade preserves from the summer before she passed. Even 2 years later, he couldn't bring himself to finish the last jar, rationing it like liquid gold. "Can't have dry toast on a Tuesday," he said, spreading just enough to make the children happy while preserving what remained. The kitchen held Elena's presence in a dozen small ways. The herb garden she'd planted outside the window still thriving under Daniel's careful tending, her recipe cards tucked into the corner of the mirror above the sink, the way she'd arranged the blue and white dishes in the cabinet. Sometimes Daniel caught himself setting 4 places at the table before remembering there were only 3 of them now. "Mrs. Henderson said there's a big storm coming," Sophia reported between bites of toast. "She said it might be the biggest one since Hurricane Elena." Daniel glanced toward the window where the morning sky showed the first hints of gray on the horizon. The weatherman had been tracking the system for days, a late-season nor'easter that promised to test every roof, window, and foundation along the Maine coast. For a small business owner whose medical equipment repair shop depended on both planned maintenance and emergency calls, storms were both blessing and curse. They brought work, but they also brought worry about his own small home and the children who depended on him. "We'll be fine," he assured them, the same words Elena used to say when storms approached. "Our house has weathered worse than whatever's coming." Leo looked up from his geometric egg arrangement. "Will you have to work in the rain again?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Last month, Daniel had been called out during a thunderstorm when the hospital's backup generator had failed during a power outage. He'd come home soaked and shivering, and both children had worried themselves sick until he walked through the door. Being a single parent meant every risk felt magnified, every decision weighted with consequences beyond himself. "Only if someone really needs help," Daniel said, which was his way of saying yes without making promises he might not be able to keep. In a city like Seaforth Bay, where the regional medical center served 3 counties and his was one of only 2 certified repair services, emergency calls often meant the difference between life-saving equipment functioning or failing when patients needed it most. By afternoon, the storm had arrived with a vengeance. Daniel stood in his shop watching sheets of rain lash against the windows while thunder rolled across the bay. The leak in his own roof had started again, a steady drip into the bucket he'd positioned near his workbench. He'd been putting off the repair for months, always finding reasons to help other people first. The phone rang just as he was considering closing early to pick up the kids from their after-school program. "Reyes Medical Equipment Repair," he answered, raising his voice over the wind that howled around the building's corners. "Mr. Reyes, this is Lydia Cho. I'm calling on behalf of Dr. Alexandra Pierce." The voice was crisp, professional, with an undertone of urgency. "We have an emergency situation at the villa. The roof has been damaged, and water is threatening some very important equipment and archives." Daniel knew the name. Everyone in Seaforth Bay did. Dr. Alexandra Pierce lived in the imposing stone mansion that dominated the headland above the city, a Gothic revival masterpiece built in the 1880s. Her late husband had founded Pierce Medical Innovations, the company that had revolutionized cardiac monitoring equipment and built a fortune worth hundreds of millions. Since his death in a plane crash 5 years ago, Alexandra had become something of a ghost, visible only in the occasional glimpse of a figure moving behind the mansion's tall windows. "Ma'am, I appreciate the call, but this storm—" "Mr. Reyes, I understand the weather is dangerous, but Dr. Pierce has critical research materials that cannot be replaced. Medical patents, surgical notes from her years as a cardiac surgeon, her late husband's prototype designs. If water reaches them—" The woman's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Daniel looked out at the storm, then at the bucket catching drips from his own roof. He thought about Sophia and Leo, safe in the community center's after-school program until 6 o'clock. He thought about the mortgage payment due next week and the groceries they needed. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, he said. The drive up to the Pierce villa was treacherous, the winding coastal road slick with rain and debris. Daniel's pickup truck groaned against the wind, its headlights cutting through the gray afternoon like weak flashlights. More than once, he questioned his decision to venture out in weather that had most sensible people barricaded in their homes. The mansion loomed out of the storm like something from a Gothic novel, its dark stone walls and towering spires making it appear more fortress than home. Lightning illuminated the damage. Several slate roof tiles had been torn away, leaving gaping holes that allowed rain to pour into what he could only assume were the upper floors. A figure emerged from a side entrance, hurrying toward his truck with an umbrella that was doing little good in the driving rain. Lydia Cho was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and wearing rain gear that suggested she'd dealt with emergencies before. "Thank you for coming," she said as Daniel gathered his tools from the truck bed. "Dr. Pierce rarely receives visitors, but she's been watching the damage from her library. She'll want to speak with you about what needs to be done." Daniel followed her through a servant's entrance into a world that felt like stepping back in time. The hallways were lined with oil paintings and furnished with antiques that probably cost more than his annual income. Their footsteps echoed on marble floors as they made their way deeper into the mansion. "How long has she lived here alone?" Daniel asked, noting the dust covers on furniture in rooms they passed. "Since her husband died," Lydia replied, "she closed most of the house off. Now she mainly uses the library, the kitchen, and her bedroom. The staff comes in daily, but she prefers solitude." They reached a heavy oak door, and Lydia knocked softly before entering. "Dr. Pierce? Mr. Reyes is here." The library was magnificent, 3 stories of books reaching toward a vaulted ceiling, with reading nooks tucked between towering shelves. But Daniel's attention was immediately drawn to the woman standing near the tall windows, watching water drip from the ceiling into hastily placed containers. Dr. Alexandra Pierce was not what he had expected. Somehow, the stories around town had created an image of an elderly recluse, but the woman before him appeared to be in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a sweater, but carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "Mr. Reyes," she said, turning to face him, "thank you for coming out in this weather. I know it's asking a lot." Her voice was softer than he'd expected, with traces of weariness that went deeper than the current crisis. When their eyes met, Daniel felt something unexpected, a recognition, as if he were looking at someone who understood the weight of holding things together when everything wanted to fall apart. "Ma'am," he replied, setting down his toolbox. "Let me take a look at what we're dealing with." Daniel studied the water damage, his trained eye cataloging the scope of work needed. Above them, the storm continued its assault on the mansion's ancient slate roof, each gust of wind threatening to tear away more tiles and expand the breach that was already allowing torrents of rain into the library. "The immediate concern is stopping the water," he said, speaking as much to himself as to Dr. Pierce. "I can get tarps up there tonight, but a permanent fix will take at least 2 days, maybe 3 if we find structural damage underneath." Alexandra nodded, watching him work with an intensity that made Daniel slightly self-conscious. "Whatever it takes, these archives." She gestured toward the leather-bound volumes lining the shelves, many of them bearing water stains along their spines. "Some of these surgical journals date back 30 years. My husband's early prototype designs are irreplaceable." "You were a surgeon?" Daniel asked, surprised. The local rumors had painted her as simply a wealthy widow, but there was something in the way she spoke about the medical materials that suggested deeper knowledge. "Cardiac surgery. 15 years at Mass General before." She paused, her gaze drifting toward a framed photograph on the desk, a younger version of herself standing beside a man with kind eyes and graying temples. "Before I came here to help Michael build the company." Daniel noticed the way her voice changed when she mentioned her late husband, softer but also more distant, as if she were reciting facts rather than sharing memories. He had heard the same tone in his own voice when people asked about Elena. "I'll need to work through the night to get this secured," he said, pulling his attention back to the immediate problem. "The storm's supposed to peak around midnight, and if we lose more tiles before I can get the tarps in place." "Of course, whatever you need." Alexandra moved toward an antique desk in the corner. "Lydia can arrange payment." "Ma'am," Daniel interrupted, then caught himself at the sharpness in his tone. "I'm sorry. It's just, I charge for materials and fair labor, nothing more." Something shifted in Alexandra's expression, a flicker of curiosity replacing the polite formality. "Most contractors add emergency surcharges for weather like this." "I'm not most contractors." Daniel hefted his toolbox, already mentally calculating the safest route to the roof. "I have 2 kids at home. I need enough to keep them fed and housed, but I don't need to get rich off other people's emergencies." For a moment, the only sound was rain drumming against the tall windows. Then Alexandra smiled, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her since arriving. "Your children are lucky to have you," she said quietly. "Sophia and Leo." The names came automatically, the way they always did when Daniel thought about his purpose in life. "They're 10 and 8. Sophia would love this library. She reads everything she can get her hands on. Leo's more practical, like his old man. He'd probably want to know how the roof structure works." "They're at home tonight?" "After-school program until 6, then Mrs. Martinez next door watches them when I have emergency calls." Daniel realized he was sharing more than necessary, but something about Alexandra's questions felt genuinely interested rather than politely conversational. "It's not ideal, but it works." "Single parenting is never ideal," Alexandra said with a knowing tone that surprised him, "but you adapt." Before he could ask what she meant, Lydia appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Pierce, I've prepared the guest room if Mr. Reyes needs to rest between work periods." "That's not necessary," Daniel began, but Alexandra raised a hand. "You can't drive down that road safely in this storm, and you'll need dry clothes if you're working on the roof all night. Please, it's the least I can do." The next several hours blurred together in a haze of rain, wind, and stubborn slate tiles. Daniel made trip after trip up to the roof, each journey more treacherous than the last as the storm reached its full fury. The mansion's height put him directly in the path of winds that threatened to tear him from the ladder, but he persevered, methodically securing tarps and temporary bracing that would hold until morning. Through it all, he was aware of a figure watching from the library windows. Alexandra, standing vigil as he worked. Twice, Lydia appeared with hot coffee and dry towels. Once, when a particularly vicious gust nearly knocked him off balance, he saw Alexandra step closer to the window, her hand pressed against the glass, as if she could somehow steady him through sheer will. By 3 in the morning, the immediate crisis was contained. The library was no longer taking on water, and the temporary repairs would hold until he could return with proper materials. Daniel climbed down from the roof one final time, exhausted, but satisfied with the night's work. He found Alexandra still in the library, curled in a leather chair with a blanket around her shoulders and a book in her lap, though he doubted she'd been able to concentrate on reading. "It's secure," he reported, accepting the towel Lydia handed him. "I'll be back in the morning with materials for the permanent fix." "Thank you." Alexandra closed her book and stood, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd been sitting still too long. "I watched you work. You could have done a temporary patch and left. But you didn't." Daniel shrugged, suddenly aware of how he must look. Soaked, exhausted, probably smelling like wet roofing tar. "My grandfather always said if something's worth doing, it's worth doing right the first time." Wise man. He was. Taught me everything I know about fixing things. Daniel gathered his tools, noting that his hands were steadier than they'd been an hour ago. The work had calmed him, the way it always did. Problem is, some things can't be fixed. Sometimes you just have to learn to live with the damage. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than he'd intended. Alexandra's eyes met his, and in that moment, Daniel saw past the wealth and the mansion and the careful walls she'd built around herself. He saw a woman who understood exactly what he meant. "Yes," she said quietly, "sometimes you do." When Daniel finally left the mansion at dawn, driving carefully down the storm-cleared roads toward home, he carried with him more than just the promise of payment for a roof repair. He carried the memory of a conversation that had felt like recognition. Two people who'd learned to navigate loss differently, but with the same fundamental understanding that some storms leave permanent changes in their wake. The toolbox sat beside him on the passenger seat, ready for another day's work. But for the first time in months, Daniel found himself looking forward to returning to a job site, curious about the woman in the shadows who watched storms with the patience of someone who'd weathered more than her share. 3 days later, Daniel returned to the Pierce villa with Sophia and Leo in tow. The permanent roof repairs had taken longer than expected. The storm damage had revealed underlying structural issues that needed addressing, and his usual after-school childcare had fallen through when Mrs. Martinez came down with flu. Usually. "Holy cow!" Sophia breathed as they approached the mansion's imposing entrance. "It really does look like a castle." Leo pressed his face to the truck's window, studying the Gothic towers and ornate stonework with his characteristic attention to detail. Why would someone need a house this big? "Different people need different things," Daniel replied, though he'd wondered the same thing during his previous visits. The mansion felt less like a home than a monument to loneliness, with most of its rooms closed off and draped in dust covers. Lydia met them at the main entrance this time, her professional demeanor softening when she saw the children. "Dr. Pierce is expecting you in the library. She's curious about your assistance." Sophia immediately took charge, extending her hand with the confidence of someone who'd never met a stranger. "I'm Sophia Reyes, and this is my brother Leo. Dad says you help take care of this whole place by yourself." "Among other things," Lydia replied, clearly charmed despite herself. "Your father has been very helpful these past few days." As they made their way through the mansion's corridors, Daniel noticed changes from his previous visits. Dust covers had been removed from furniture in the main hallway, and afternoon sunlight streamed through windows that had clearly been cleaned recently. The house felt less like a mausoleum and more like a home that was tentatively awakening. They found Alexandra in the library, standing near the tall windows where Daniel had first seen her. She'd changed from the casual clothes she'd worn during the storm emergency. Today she wore a simple dress and cardigan that somehow made her appear more approachable while still maintaining an air of quiet elegance. "Dr. Pierce," Daniel said, "these are my children, Sophia and Leo. I hope you don't mind." "I don't mind at all." Alexandra's voice was gentler than he remembered, and when she looked at the children, something in her expression softened. "Welcome to my home." Sophia immediately launched into questions with her typical directness. "Is it true you used to fix people's hearts?" "Dad fixes medical equipment, but he says doctors are the ones who really help people." Alexandra glanced at Daniel with surprise and something that might have been amusement. "Your father fixes the machines that help us save lives. That's just as important as what doctors do." "Can we see the room where the roof was broken?" Leo asked, his practical mind already focused on the repairs. "Dad said there was water everywhere." Of course, Alexandra gestured toward the area where Daniel had worked. Your father did remarkable work. Everything is completely dry now. As the children examined the repair site, firing questions at Daniel about techniques and materials, Alexandra watched with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read. There was wistfulness there, but also something else, a kind of hunger, as if she were memorizing every detail of their interaction. "They're wonderful," she said quietly, moving to stand beside Daniel. "How old did you say they were?" "Sophia's 10, Leo's 8. Daniel felt the familiar swell of pride that came whenever someone complimented his children. "They're good kids. They've had to grow up faster than I'd like, but they're resilient," Alexandra finished. "Children often are, more than we give them credit for." Something in her tone made Daniel study her profile. "You sound like you speak from experience." "I had a younger brother," Alexandra said after a moment. "He died when I was 15, congenital heart defect. It's part of what drove me toward cardiac surgery." "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." Alexandra's voice carried the practiced calm of someone who'd learned to discuss painful topics without flinching. "But watching your children, it reminds me what I loved about pediatric rounds. The way children approach the world with such curiosity, even in difficult circumstances." "Dr. Pierce?" Sophia had abandoned her examination of the roof repairs and was now studying the walls lined with books. "Have you read all of these?" Alexandra smiled, the second genuine smile Daniel had seen from her. "Not all of them, but many. Some belong to my husband. He collected first editions of medical texts." "What's a first edition?" Leo asked, joining his sister near the bookshelves. "The very first time a book was published," Alexandra explained, pulling down a leather-bound volume. "This one is from 1628. It's one of the earliest descriptions of blood circulation." Sophia's eyes widened. "That's older than America." "Much older." Alexandra handled the book with reverent care. "Your father mentioned you love to read. Would you like to see some of the other special books?" For the next hour, Daniel watched as Alexandra guided his children through sections of the library, sharing stories about rare manuscripts and historical medical texts with the enthusiasm of a natural teacher. Leo was fascinated by diagrams of early surgical instruments, while Sophia peppered Alexandra with questions about everything from medieval medicine to modern heart surgery. The transformation in Alexandra was remarkable. The guarded, formal woman he'd met during the storm had been replaced by someone animated and engaged, her intelligence and passion evident in every explanation she offered the children. When Sophia asked about a portrait hanging above the fireplace, a stern-looking man in Victorian dress, Alexandra's voice took on the warm tones of a storyteller. "That's Ezekiel Pierce, who built this house. He made his fortune in shipping and railroads, but he lost 3 children to diseases that we can easily treat today. That's why he endowed the town's first hospital." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "So helping sick people has been important to your family for a long time," Sophia observed with her characteristic directness. "Yes," Alexandra replied, glancing toward the photograph of her late husband on the desk. "Very long time." As the afternoon wore on, Daniel found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't expected. The formal atmosphere of the mansion seemed to dissolve under the influence of his children's natural curiosity and Alexandra's patient responses. When Leo discovered a chess set on a side table and challenged Alexandra to a game, she accepted with obvious delight. "Fair warning," Daniel said as they set up the pieces, "Leo takes chess very seriously." "So do I," Alexandra replied, studying Leo's careful arrangement of his pieces. "Your move, Mr. Reyes." "Just Leo," the boy corrected, then proceeded to open with a strategy that made Alexandra raise her eyebrows in appreciation. While they played, Sophia curled up in one of the leather chairs with a book about the history of medicine, occasionally reading passages aloud that particularly interested her. Daniel used the time to check his work on the roof repairs, but found himself repeatedly drawn back to the scene in the library. His children completely at ease in surroundings that should have intimidated them, and Alexandra more relaxed and natural than he'd seen her. "Checkmate," Leo announced after 20 minutes of careful play. Alexandra studied the board, then laughed, a sound of genuine surprise and delight. "You're right, I didn't see that combination coming." "Dad taught me that one," Leo said proudly. "He learned it from Grandpa Reyes." "Your grandfather must have been a formidable chess player." "He was good at lots of things, Sophia chimed in from her chair. Dad says we get our stubborn streak from him. Stubborn can be a virtue, Alexandra said, meeting Daniel's eyes across the chessboard. Especially when it means not giving up on things that matter. As they prepared to leave, Lydia appeared with a small bag. Dr. Pierce thought the children might enjoy these, she said, handing it to Sophia. Inside were 2 books, a beautifully illustrated history of medicine for Sophia and a beginner's guide to architecture for Leo, both clearly chosen with their specific interests in mind. Thank you, Sophia said, immediately hugging the book to her chest. This is amazing! Leo was more reserved but equally pleased, carefully examining the architectural drawings in his gift. Thank you, Dr. Pierce. The chess game was really fun, too. You're both welcome any time, Alexandra replied, and Daniel could hear in her voice that she meant it. This house has been too quiet for too long. As they walked toward the truck, Sophia tugged on Daniel's sleeve. Dad, I like her. She's not scary at all. She's lonely, Leo added with his characteristic insight. Like us, but different. Daniel glanced back at the mansion, where Alexandra stood in the doorway watching them leave. Even from a distance, he could see the wistfulness in her posture, the way someone might stand who was watching a life they wished they could be part of. Maybe she doesn't have to be lonely, Sophia said thoughtfully. Maybe nobody does. As they drove down the winding road toward town, Daniel found himself thinking about the afternoon. How natural it had felt to share his children's laughter with someone else. How Alexandra had come alive in their presence. For the first time since Elena's death, he could imagine opening their small family circle to include someone new. The thought should have frightened him. Instead, it filled him with something that felt suspiciously like hope. The Pierce Medical Innovations boardroom occupied the entire top floor of a gleaming Boston high-rise, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering commanding views of the harbor. Margaret Pierce sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, her silver hair perfectly styled, and her navy suit projecting the kind of authority that came from decades of wielding corporate power. At 72, she remained formidable, the kind of woman who could silence a room with a raised eyebrow and had built her late son's company into a medical empire through sheer force of will. The quarterly reports show steady growth, Dr. Julian Kerr was saying, his presentation slides reflecting off the table's glossy surface. As acting CEO, he'd run day-to-day operations since Alexandra's withdrawal from active leadership, and his polished confidence filled the room like expensive cologne. However, our board positions remain complicated. Margaret's pale blue eyes swept the room, taking inventory of the 12 other board members, family friends, longtime investors, and medical industry veterans who'd trusted the Pierce name for nearly 2 decades. Complicated how, Julian? Alexandra's extended absence from board meetings continues to raise questions about leadership stability. Our investors are beginning to ask pointed questions about succession planning. And they should, Margaret replied crisply. My daughter-in-law has been effectively absent from this company for 2 years. Grief is understandable, but abandoning one's responsibilities is not. Around the table, board members shifted uncomfortably. Alexandra's reputation as a brilliant surgeon and strategic thinker had been legendary during her active years. But her retreat from public life after Michael's death had created a leadership vacuum that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. There's something else, Margaret continued, consulting the tablet beside her coffee cup. I've received concerning reports about Alexandra's social activities. Julian leaned forward, his expression carefully neutral. What kind of reports? She's been entertaining a local handyman at the villa. Daniel Reyes, a widower with 2 children who runs a small medical equipment repair service. Margaret's tone made it clear what she thought of such associations. Apparently his children have been spending considerable time at the house as well. Board member Patricia Hawthorne, a longtime family friend, frowned. Margaret, surely Alexandra is entitled to friendships. Friendships? Margaret's voice carried the sharp edge that had made her feared in corporate circles for decades. Patricia, we're not discussing casual social connections. According to my sources, this man and his children have been regular guests at the villa for weeks. They've had dinner together, spent weekends there. The household staff is talking. What exactly are you suggesting? Asked Dr. Richard Chen, the board's senior medical advisor. Margaret stood and moved to the windows, her reflection ghost-like against the afternoon sky. I'm suggesting that a woman who's been emotionally unstable since her husband's death may be making decisions that compromise not only her own judgment, but the integrity of this company. That's a serious accusation, Julian said carefully. He'd worked closely with Alexandra during her active years and respected her intelligence, but he'd also watched her retreat into isolation and understood Margaret's concerns about leadership continuity. It's a serious situation. Margaret returned to her seat, her movements precise and controlled. This company represents Michael's legacy, a legacy built on scientific excellence, medical innovation, and impeccable professional standards. I will not allow it to be compromised by inappropriate relationships. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the newest board member, cleared her throat. Margaret, with respect, what Alexandra does in her private life is not private when it affects shareholder confidence, Margaret interrupted. We have a fiduciary responsibility to protect this company's interests. If Alexandra cannot separate her personal indulgences from her professional obligations, then perhaps it's time to consider alternative leadership structures. The room fell silent. Everyone understood the implication. Margaret was preparing to challenge Alexandra's controlling interest in the company, a move that would require board support and careful legal maneuvering. Julian studied his hands, weighing his words. What are you proposing? I'm proposing that we document Alexandra's pattern of neglect and emotional instability. Her absence from board meetings, her withdrawal from strategic planning, and now this questionable relationship with someone who has no business in our world. Margaret's voice was steady, businesslike. If necessary, we can petition the court to review her fitness as a corporate guardian of Michael's trust. Patricia shifted uncomfortably. Margaret, that seems extreme. Extreme situations require decisive action. Margaret's expression softened slightly, showing a glimpse of the woman who genuinely loved her daughter-in-law during happier times. I'm not doing this out of malice, Patricia. I'm doing it because someone needs to protect what Michael built. If Alexandra won't step up, then we must step in. Meanwhile, 40 miles north in Seaforth Bay, Alexandra was completely unaware of the corporate maneuvering taking place in her name. She stood in the villa's kitchen, teaching Sophia how to make her late husband's favorite chocolate chip cookies, while Leo and Daniel worked together to repair a loose cabinet door. The secret is browning the butter first, Alexandra explained, demonstrating the technique with patient precision. Michael's grandmother taught me this recipe when we first got married. Sophia watched intently, measuring ingredients with the same careful attention she applied to everything that interested her. Was he a good cook, too? Terrible, Alexandra laughed, the sound filling the kitchen with warmth. He once tried to surprise me with dinner and nearly burned down our first apartment. After that, we agreed cooking was my domain. Dad's not much better, Sophia confided. He makes really good pancakes, but everything else is pretty basic. From across the kitchen, Daniel looked up from the cabinet repair. I heard that. I'll have you know my grilled cheese sandwiches are legendary. Legendarily burned, Leo added with 8-year-old frankness, earning laughter from everyone. Alexandra found herself marveling at how natural this felt. The easy banter, the shared tasks, the way the children moved through her kitchen as if they belonged there. For 2 years, this house had felt like a museum, every room preserved exactly as Michael had left it. But with Daniel and his children present, it was beginning to feel like a home again. Alexandra, Daniel said, testing the cabinet door's alignment. I've been thinking about what you mentioned, about wanting to do more with the company's charitable programs. She paused in her explanation of cookie consistency to Sophia. What about it? Well, I work with a lot of rural clinics and smaller hospitals. They're always struggling with equipment maintenance, usually because they can't afford service contracts. Daniel's expression grew thoughtful. What if Pierce Medical had an outreach program, subsidized repairs and maintenance for underserved areas? Alexandra considered this, her strategic mind engaging in a way it hadn't for months. That's actually brilliant. We have the resources, and it would align perfectly with Michael's original vision for the company. Dad's always helping people for free, Leo said proudly. Mama used to say he had a bleeding heart. Your mama was right, Alexandra said softly, meeting Daniel's eyes across the kitchen. But bleeding hearts often heal the most people. As the afternoon wore on, the 4 of them settled into an easy rhythm, cookies baking in the oven, small repairs being completed around the house, conversation flowing naturally between practical matters and shared memories. It felt, Alexandra realized with surprise, like family. She was pulling the last batch of cookies from the oven when Lydia appeared in the doorway, her usually composed expression troubled. "Dr. Pierce, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you have a call from Julian Kerr. He says it's urgent." Alexandra frowned, wiping her hands on her apron. Julian rarely called unless there was a significant company matter requiring her attention. "Can you take a message?" "He's already called 3 times. He seems quite insistent." With an apologetic look at Daniel and the children, Alexandra took the call in her study. Julian's voice was carefully neutral, but she could hear tension underneath his professional tone. "Alexandra, I need to speak with you about some concerns that have been raised regarding your recent activities." "What kind of concerns?" "Margaret has been asking questions about your social connections, specifically about Daniel Reyes and his children spending time at the villa." Alexandra felt something cold settle in her stomach. What business is that of the board's? Under normal circumstances, none. But given your extended absence from company affairs, some members are questioning your judgment. Margaret is particularly concerned about the optics. "The optics," Alexandra repeated, her voice flat. "Alexandra, I'm not trying to cause problems, but you need to understand that your position with the company isn't as secure as you might think. Margaret has been building support for a leadership review." After ending the call, Alexandra stood in her study for a long moment, listening to the sounds of laughter from the kitchen. She'd been so focused on rediscovering joy that she'd forgotten the corporate world didn't recognize happiness as a valid form of healing. When she returned to the kitchen, Daniel took one look at her face and sent the children to explore the library while he helped clean up. "Bad news?" he asked quietly. "Complicated news," Alexandra replied, watching Sophia and Leo disappear down the hallway. "It seems our friendship has attracted unwanted attention." Daniel's expression grew serious. "From your family?" "From people who think they know what's best for me." Alexandra looked around the kitchen, taking in the lingering warmth of the afternoon. Cookie crumbs on the counter, Sophia's carefully written notes about the recipe, Leo's forgotten toy car near the window. "Daniel, I need you to know that whatever comes next, this afternoon, these past weeks, they've meant everything to me." "Alexandra, you're scaring me a little. What exactly are we talking about?" Before she could answer, her phone rang again. This time it was Margaret herself, her voice crisp and unforgiving. "Alexandra, dear, I think it's time we had a conversation about your future with Pierce Medical, and about the company you've been keeping." The following evening, Daniel found Alexandra sitting alone in the villa's garden, a glass of untouched wine in her hands and her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was setting over Seaforth Bay. She'd called him earlier, her voice carefully controlled but carrying an undertone of vulnerability that had made him promise to come by after the children were settled at Mrs. Martinez's for the night. "I'm glad you came," she said without looking up as he approached the stone bench where she sat. "I wasn't sure you would, after what I told you about the board." Daniel settled beside her, leaving enough space to respect her obvious need for distance while still offering his presence. "You said you needed to talk. Here I am." Alexandra finally turned to face him, and in the evening light, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Not physical tiredness, but the deep weariness that came from carrying heavy truths alone. "I haven't been entirely honest with you about my situation." "What do you mean?" "About why I stopped practicing medicine. About why I live like a ghost in this house." Alexandra set down her wine glass with hands that weren't quite steady. "About what really happened when Michael died." Daniel waited, understanding instinctively that pushing for answers would only make her retreat further into herself. He'd learned this lesson during Elena's illness. Sometimes the most powerful thing you could offer someone was simply your presence and patience. "Michael and I met during my residency at Mass General," Alexandra began, her voice taking on the distant quality of someone revisiting painful memories. "He was brilliant, not just smart, but visionary. He saw connections between technology and healing that no one else could see." She paused, watching a seagull circle over the water before continuing. "We built the company together. He handled the business side. I provided the medical expertise. We were partners in everything. Work, life, dreams for the future." "It sounds like you were happy." "We were." Alexandra's smile was soft but edged with sorrow. "We tried for years to have children. Fertility treatments, specialists, everything. Nothing worked. So we threw ourselves into the company instead, channeling all that parental energy into something that could help other families." Daniel felt a stab of understanding. He and Elena had been fortunate. Their children had come easily, naturally. But he'd seen enough friends struggle with infertility to understand the particular grief it carried. The plane crash happened on a Thursday, Alexandra continued, her voice growing quieter. Michael was flying to a medical conference in Chicago. Weather turned bad and… She gestured helplessly. I was in surgery when they called. Emergency procedure on a 16-year-old boy who'd been in a car accident. Jesus, Alexandra. I finished the surgery first. The admission came out flat, matter of fact. Can you believe that? My husband was dead. And I finished the surgery because that's what doctors do. We compartmentalize. We function. Daniel reached for her hand without thinking, covering her cold fingers with his warm ones. You saved that boy's life. Did I? Or did I just use him as an excuse to avoid facing reality for 3 more hours? Alexandra's laugh was bitter. The board thinks I fell apart after Michael died, but the truth is worse than that. I held it together perfectly. Too perfectly. I went back to work the next week, attended board meetings, made strategic decisions, performed surgeries with the same precision I always had. That doesn't sound like falling apart. No, it doesn't. It sounds like someone who was terrified that if she stopped moving, stopped functioning, she might never start again. Alexandra pulled her hand free and wrapped her arms around herself. I was a machine, Daniel. A very efficient, highly functional machine. And then one day, I looked around and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt anything at all. Daniel studied her profile, beginning to understand the depth of isolation she'd constructed around herself. So you stopped. I stopped everything. Resigned from the hospital, withdrew from active management of the company, moved up here permanently. Alexandra gestured toward the villa. I told myself I needed time to grieve, but the truth was I'd forgotten how to be human. And now I'm terrified that I'm using you and your children the same way I used that surgery, as an excuse to avoid dealing with reality. The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for weeks. What if I'm not capable of genuine connection anymore? What if I'm just so desperate for something real that I'm projecting feelings that aren't actually there? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. Can I tell you about Elena's last month? Alexandra nodded, sensing the importance of whatever he was about to share. She was in hospice by then. The cancer had spread everywhere, and we all knew she was dying. Daniel's hands clenched involuntarily at the memory. The kids were so young. Sophia was 8, Leo was 6. They didn't really understand what was happening, just that Mama was sick and Dad was sad all the time. That must have been impossible. It was. But you know what the hardest part was? Elena kept apologizing. For getting sick, for leaving me alone with the kids, for not being able to fight harder. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. She actually apologized for dying, as if it were something she was choosing to do to hurt us. Alexandra turned to face him fully, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I spent so much energy trying to convince her that none of it was her fault that I almost missed something crucial, Daniel continued. 3 days before she died, she took my hand and said, "Promise me you won't use our love as an excuse to stop living." What did she mean? She meant that grief can become a prison if you let it, that loving someone who's gone doesn't mean you stop loving people who are here. Daniel met Alexandra's eyes directly. Elena made me promise that if I ever found someone who made me want to build a life again, I wouldn't let guilt or fear stop me. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of waves against the rocks below and the distant call of night birds. Are you saying you found someone like that? Alexandra asked quietly. I'm saying that when I watch you with my children, when I see you come alive in ways you probably don't even realize, I remember what it feels like to hope for more than just survival. Daniel reached for her hand again, this time holding on when she tried to pull away. And I'm saying that whatever this is between us, it's not you using us as an excuse. It's you learning to live again. Alexandra stared down at their joined hands. Margaret thinks you're after my money. Are you after mine? Daniel asked with a slight smile. Despite everything, Alexandra laughed. I think I could probably manage without your vast repair shop fortune. Then maybe Margaret's opinion isn't the one that matters here. They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over the bay, each lost in their own thoughts but no longer alone with them. Finally, Alexandra spoke again. Daniel, there's something else you need to know. If this continues, If we continue, it won't just be Margaret you'll have to deal with. There will be media attention, corporate politics, people who see you as a threat to a $150 million empire. Is that what you see me as, a threat? I see you as the first person in 2 years who's made me want to be more than just a functioning shell of myself. Alexandra's voice was steady now, the earlier uncertainty replaced by something stronger. But I need to know that you understand what you'd be walking into. Daniel considered this, thinking about his quiet life in Seaforth Bay, his children's need for stability, the simple satisfaction of fixing things with his hands. Then he thought about the woman beside him, brilliant, wounded, slowly finding her way back to herself, and realized the choice wasn't as complicated as it might seem. Alexandra, 2 years ago I thought my life was over. I thought the best I could hope for was to keep my kids safe and maybe find small moments of peace between the grief. He squeezed her hand gently. If there's a chance, even a small one, that we could build something real together, then I'm willing to face whatever comes with it. Even if it means your life changes completely? My life already changed completely when Elena died. The question is whether it changes into something better or just different. Daniel turned to face her fully. With you, it feels like it could be better. For the first time since he'd known her, Alexandra smiled without reservation, an expression of pure hope that transformed her entire face. Then maybe we should stop letting other people decide what's possible for us. As they walked back toward the villa together, Daniel felt something shift inside his chest. Not the sharp pain of loss that had lived there for 2 years, but something warmer and more expansive. It felt like the beginning of a different kind of life, one built not on the ruins of what he'd lost, but on the foundation of what he might yet find. Behind them, the lights of Seaforth Bay twinkled like stars reflected in dark water, while ahead, the villa's windows glowed with warm light, no longer a monument to isolation, but a home where laughter might once again echo through rooms that had been silent too long. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp October air that made everything seem possible. Alexandra stood at the villa's kitchen window, watching Daniel and Leo examine the herb garden while Sophia helped Lydia gather the last of the season's tomatoes. The scene felt surreal. Her carefully ordered, solitary world had somehow expanded to accommodate the cheerful chaos of family life, and rather than feeling invaded, she felt more at home than she had in years. "The basil's still good," Daniel called out, holding up a handful of fragrant leaves. "Sophia, didn't you say you wanted to learn how to make pesto?" "Yes." Sophia abandoned the tomato harvest and bounded over to examine the herbs. "Dr. Pierce, do you know how to make pesto?" "Dad's never tried it." Alexandra laughed, tying an apron around her waist. "I think I can manage. It was one of Michael's favorite things." The mention of her late husband came naturally now, without the sharp stab of pain that had once accompanied any reference to their shared life. Over the past weeks, Daniel's gentle presence had somehow made it possible for her to speak of Michael with love rather than just loss. "Can we make it from scratch?" Leo asked, his methodical nature already engaged with the project. "Like, really from scratch with the mortar and pestle?" "Absolutely." Alexandra pulled the marble mortar and pestle from a cabinet where it had sat unused for years. Michael insisted this was the only proper way to make pesto. He said food processors were for people who didn't understand the importance of patience. As they worked together, Sophia carefully washing basil leaves, Leo measuring pine nuts with scientific precision, Daniel grating Parmesan with the steady rhythm of someone accustomed to working with his hands, Alexandra found herself thinking about Michael's presence in the kitchen. For so long, his memory had felt like a weight, something that anchored her to the past and prevented her from moving forward. But today, with Daniel and the children filling the space with new energy, Michael's memory felt more like a blessing, a foundation on which something new could be built. "This is hard work," Sophia announced, taking her turn at the mortar and pestle. The basil was slowly transforming into a fragrant green paste under her determined efforts. "The best things usually are," Alexandra replied, watching the girl's face scrunch with concentration. "But see how much better it smells than the store-bought kind?" "Dad, you should learn this recipe," Leo said practically. "We could make it at home." Daniel caught Alexandra's eye over Leo's head, and something passed between them, a recognition that home was beginning to mean something different for all of them. Maybe I should, he agreed quietly. By noon, they'd produced not just fresh pesto but also a memorable mess. Flour dusted every surface from their attempt at homemade pasta. Basil leaves clung to Sophia's hair, and Leo had somehow managed to get pine nuts in his shoe. Alexandra couldn't remember the last time her pristine kitchen had looked so thoroughly used, and she loved every bit of it. "This is delicious," Daniel said as they finally sat down to eat. "The kids are going to expect gourmet cooking from now on." "I like cooking with other people," Alexandra admitted, twirling pasta around her fork. "I'd forgotten how much more fun it is than cooking alone." "Do you usually eat by yourself?" Sophia asked with her characteristic directness. "Usually." Alexandra didn't elaborate on the countless solitary meals she'd eaten in the villa's formal dining room, or the way she'd sometimes forgotten to eat altogether when work consumed her attention. "That's sad," Sophia announced matter-of-factly. "Eating alone makes food taste worse." "Sophia," Daniel warned gently, but Alexandra waved him off. "She's right. Food does taste better with company." Alexandra looked around the kitchen table, taking in the scene. Daniel's rolled-up sleeves and flour-dusted forearms. Sophia's animated storytelling about her latest book. Leo's careful attention to winding his pasta properly. "This is the best meal I've had in this house since Michael died." After lunch, they moved to the library, where Alexandra had prepared a surprise. She'd spent hours the night before carefully removing several rare medical texts from their protective cases, choosing volumes she thought would fascinate the children without being too fragile for careful handling. "These books are older than the United States," she explained, settling cross-legged on the floor beside a low table where she'd arranged the materials. "This one contains the first accurate drawings of human anatomy, and this one describes surgical techniques from the Renaissance." Leo immediately gravitated toward a volume of architectural drawings, his engineer's mind captivated by the precise illustrations of Gothic cathedrals and ancient Roman structures. Sophia was drawn to a collection of botanical illustrations, her artist's eye appreciating the delicate detail of each flower and leaf. "Look at this," Sophia breathed, studying a drawing of a medieval herb garden. They knew which plants could help sick people just by watching them grow. "Traditional medicine," Alexandra agreed. "Many of our modern drugs started as folk remedies that were refined and purified." Daniel found himself examining a leather-bound journal filled with handwritten surgical notes. "These are incredible, the precision, the attention to detail." "That belonged to one of the first cardiac surgeons in America," Alexandra said, moving to sit beside him. "He performed the first successful heart valve repair in 1923. Every surgery he ever did is documented in there." As the afternoon wore on, the library filled with the kind of comfortable quiet that came from people deeply engaged in shared discovery. Alexandra watched Daniel help Leo trace architectural elements in one of the books, while Sophia carefully copied botanical drawings into her own sketchbook, and felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation she almost didn't recognize after years of numbness. It was contentment. Pure, simple contentment. "Alexandra," Daniel said quietly, looking up from the surgical journal, "thank you for sharing all of this with us." "Thank you for bringing life back to this house," she replied, meaning it more than she'd ever meant anything. As evening approached, they moved to the villa's garden, where Alexandra had arranged a simple picnic dinner on blankets spread across the lawn. The October air was cool but not uncomfortable, and the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the bay below. "This is like a fairy tale," Sophia announced, lying on her back and watching clouds drift across the darkening sky. "A castle, a library full of magical books, and the best pesto in the world. Don't forget the princess," Leo added with 8-year-old logic. "Every fairy tale has a princess." Alexandra laughed. "I think I'm a bit old to be a princess." "No way," Sophia said with conviction. "You're perfect princess age. And Dad could be the prince who fixes things instead of slaying dragons." Daniel's eyes met Alexandra's across the picnic blanket, both of them recognizing the innocent truth in Sophia's observation. They were both too old and too wounded to believe in fairy tale endings. But there was something to be said for fairy tale beginnings, for the possibility that even adults could find unexpected magic in their lives. As they packed up the picnic and prepared to head inside, Alexandra made a spontaneous decision. "Would you like to stay tonight?" "I have plenty of guest rooms." and tomorrow we could explore the beach caves at low tide." The children's enthusiasm was immediate and vocal, but Alexandra found herself looking at Daniel for his answer. His expression was thoughtful, and she could see him weighing the implications, not just of spending the night, but of crossing another line in their evolving relationship. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "I'm sure," Alexandra replied, and meant it completely. That night, after the children had been settled in adjoining guest rooms with clean pajamas that Lydia had somehow produced and books from the library for bedtime reading, Alexandra and Daniel found themselves alone on the villa's main terrace. The bay stretched out below them, moonlight creating a silver path across the dark water. "This weekend," Daniel said, leaning against the stone balustrade, "it feels different from the other times we've spent together." "Different how?" "More real somehow, like we're not just two people helping each other through difficult times, but actually building something together." Alexandra moved to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Is that what we're doing? Building something?" "I hope so." Daniel's voice was quiet but certain. "Because I can't imagine going back to the way things were before I met you. Even if it means dealing with Margaret and the board and all the complications that come with my world." "Alexandra, your world is the size of a boarding room compared to what you've given me." Daniel turned to face her fully. "You've given me back the possibility of happiness. You've shown my children what it looks like when adults care for each other. You've made us feel like a family again." The words hung in the night air between them, heavy with implication and possibility. Alexandra felt tears prick at her eyes, not the sharp tears of grief she'd grown accustomed to, but the softer tears that came with overwhelming gratitude. "I love you," she said simply, the words emerging without conscious decision. "I didn't plan to, and I certainly didn't expect to, but I do." Daniel's response was to cup her face gently in his hands and kiss her, not with desperate passion, but with the tender certainty of someone who'd found exactly what he hadn't known he was looking for. When they finally separated, Alexandra could hear Sophia's voice drifting from the guest room window, reading aloud to Leo from one of the medical history books. The sound filled her with such profound joy that she had to lean against Daniel for support. "They're going to want to live here permanently," Daniel murmured against her hair. "Would that be such a terrible thing?" Alexandra asked, then caught herself. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to assume." "It wouldn't be terrible at all," Daniel interrupted gently. "It would be perfect." As they stood together on the terrace, listening to the sounds of children's laughter mixing with the rhythm of waves against rocks, both of them understood that something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer two separate people, finding comfort in each other's company. They were becoming something new. A family built not on blood or legal documents, but on choice and love and the shared commitment to heal each other's wounds. Neither of them spoke of the challenges that lay ahead: Margaret's opposition, the corporate politics, the complex logistics of merging two very different lives. Those battles could be fought tomorrow. Tonight, there was only the moonlight on the water, the sound of happy children, and the revolutionary discovery that second chances could feel as magical as first loves. In the morning, Alexandra would wake to find Sophia sketching architectural details from the villa's Gothic windows, while Leo helped Daniel repair a loose shutter. She would stand in her bedroom doorway, watching this scene of domestic contentment, and realize that somewhere in the past weeks, she had stopped merely surviving and started truly living again. But tonight, she simply held Daniel's hand and listened to her house come alive with the sounds of family, grateful beyond words for the storm that had brought them all together. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier to the villa's front door, while Daniel was teaching Leo how to properly caulk window seams and Sophia was helping Alexandra catalog rare books in the library. Lydia signed for the envelope with the grim expression of someone who'd been expecting bad news, then carried it directly to Alexandra without opening it. "From Margaret's law firm," she said simply, setting the thick manila envelope on the library's antique desk. Alexandra stared at the envelope, as if it contained something venomous. She'd known this moment was coming. Margaret's increasingly hostile phone calls over the past week had made that clear, but seeing her fears made manifest in legal documents felt like being diagnosed with a disease she'd hoped might pass on its own. "What is it?" Sophia asked, looking up from the leather-bound journal she'd been carefully examining. Alexandra had no answer for that. The thought of reducing their relationship to a legal strategy felt like poisoning something pure. But the alternative, losing everything Michael had built and everything she'd hoped to create with Daniel, seemed equally impossible to accept. That evening, after a dinner that none of them had much appetite for, Daniel tucked Sophia and Leo into their beds at home while his mind wrestled with the implications of the day's revelations. Both children had sensed the tension at the villa, and their questions about why everyone seemed sad had been difficult to deflect. "Dad," Sophia said as he pulled her blankets up to her chin, "is Dr. Pierce in trouble?" Daniel sat on the edge of her bed, choosing his words carefully. "She's dealing with some complicated family issues." "Like when Grandma Pierce was mean to you at the grocery store?" Leo asked from his bed across the room. Daniel's eyebrows rose in surprise. "When did that happen?" "Last week," Sophia said matter-of-factly. "We were with Mrs. Martinez, and this lady with silver hair came up to you at the checkout. She looked at us like we were bugs, and then she said something that made you get really quiet." Daniel closed his eyes, remembering the encounter he'd hoped the children hadn't noticed. Margaret had approached him in the grocery store's parking lot, her voice polite, but her words cutting, as she'd suggested that his relationship with Alexandra was inappropriate for someone in his position. "That was Dr. Pierce's mother-in-law," Daniel admitted. "She doesn't think we should be friends." "Why not?" Leo asked with 8-year-old directness. "Because she thinks we're too different. She thinks Dr. Pierce should only be friends with people who have as much money as she does." Sophia sat up in bed, her face indignant. "That's stupid. Dr. Pierce likes us because we're interesting, not because we're rich." "You're absolutely right, sweetheart, but sometimes adults make decisions based on stupid reasons. Are you going to stop being friends with her?" Leo's voice was small, and Daniel could hear the fear underneath the question. Both children had already lost their mother. The thought of losing Alexandra, too, was clearly terrifying. "I don't want to," Daniel said honestly. "But it might not be up to me." After the children were asleep, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and tried to make sense of his options. He could marry Alexandra to help her legal case, but that would transform their relationship into something strategic rather than romantic. He could walk away entirely, protecting his children from the corporate drama, but abandoning the woman he'd fallen in love with to face Margaret's challenge alone. Or he could find some third option that preserved both their relationship and Alexandra's independence. His phone rang just after 10 o'clock. Pastor Miguel's voice was warm and familiar, offering the kind of spiritual guidance that Daniel's late wife had always sought during difficult times. "Daniel, I hope I'm not calling too late. I heard through the church network that you and the children have been spending time with Dr. Pierce." "News travels fast in a small town," Daniel replied with a rueful smile. "It does indeed. I also heard that there might be some complications arising from this friendship." Daniel found himself spilling the entire story. His growing feelings for Alexandra, the children's attachment to her, Margaret's legal challenge, and the impossible choice he now faced. Pastor Miguel listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly simply bearing witness to Daniel's struggle. "You know," the pastor said when Daniel finished, "Elena spoke to me about this possibility before she died." "What possibility?" "That you might someday fall in love again. She was quite specific about her hopes for you and the children." Pastor Miguel's voice carried the gentle authority of someone who'd counseled grieving families for decades. "She said she wanted you to promise that if you ever found someone who could love all three of you completely, you wouldn't let pride or fear stop you from embracing that gift." Daniel felt tears prick at his eyes. "She said something similar to me, but I thought she was just trying to make me feel better about the future." Elena was many things, but she was never one to offer false comfort. If she blessed the possibility of you loving again, it's because she recognized that love multiplies rather than diminishes. Pastor Miguel paused. "The question you need to ask yourself isn't whether marrying Alexandra would be strategic or romantic. The question is whether you love her enough to build a life together, regardless of the circumstances that bring you to that decision." After ending the call, Daniel sat in his quiet kitchen for another hour, thinking about Elena's final wishes, about Sophia and Leo's obvious affection for Alexandra, and about the woman who taught him that healing could happen even when you thought your heart was permanently broken. By the time he finally went to bed, Daniel had made his decision. It wasn't the safe choice or the simple choice, but it was the right choice. The one that honored both his love for Elena and his growing love for Alexandra. The one that put his children's happiness and Alexandra's well-being ahead of his own fears about what other people might think. Tomorrow he would drive to the villa and ask Alexandra Pierce to marry him. Not because a legal strategy required it, and not because corporate politics demanded it, but because sometime over the past weeks, she had become as essential to his family's happiness as air or water, or the promise of morning after the darkest night. The rest, Margaret's opposition, the court hearing, the challenge of merging two very different worlds, they would face together, as partners in every sense of the word. Daniel arrived at the villa the next morning to find Alexandra in the garden, methodically deadheading the last of the season's roses, with the focused intensity of someone trying to work through complicated emotions with her hands. She looked up when she heard his truck's engine, and he could see the sleepless night written in the shadows under her eyes. "You look like you've been thinking as hard as I have," he said, joining her among the flower beds. "I've been thinking about running away," Alexandra admitted, not looking up from the roses. "There's a research position available in Switzerland. I could sell the villa, liquidate my Pierce medical shares, and start over somewhere Margaret's lawyers can't reach me." "And leave everything Michael built?" "Michael's been dead for 5 years, Daniel. Maybe it's time I stopped trying to be the guardian of his legacy and started thinking about what I want my own life to look like." Daniel studied her profile, recognizing the defensive brittleness that had characterized her voice during their first meeting. The legal pressure was pushing her back toward the emotional isolation she'd used as protection for so long. "Is that what you really want? To run away?" Alexandra finally looked at him, and he could see the war being fought behind her eyes, between the impulse to flee and the harder choice of standing and fighting for what they'd built together. "I want to protect you and the children from the mess I've created," she said quietly. "Margaret won't stop with the court challenge. If she can't remove me legally, she'll find other ways to make our lives difficult." "Alexandra, do you love me?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. What kind of question is that? "A simple one. Do you love me?" "Of course I love you. That's not the point." "It's exactly the point." Daniel moved closer, taking the pruning shears from her hands and setting them aside. "Everything else is just logistics. Corporate politics, legal challenges, family drama, those are all problems that can be solved. But if we love each other, and if we love those kids, then we figure out how to make it work. It's not that simple. Isn't it?" Daniel took her hands in his, noting how cold her fingers were despite the mild morning air. "Marry me." Alexandra stared at him. "Daniel, we talked about this yesterday. I won't have you proposing to me because my lawyer thinks it would help in court. I'm not proposing because of your lawyer. I'm proposing because I realized something last night." Daniel's voice grew stronger, more certain. "I'm proposing because Elena made me promise that if I ever found someone who could love all 3 of us completely, I wouldn't let fear stop me from embracing that gift." "Elena said that?" "Among other things. She also said that love multiplies rather than diminishes, and that building a new family doesn't mean forgetting the love that came before." Daniel squeezed Alexandra's hands gently. "I love you, Alexandra. Not because you're wealthy, or because you live in a mansion, or because you can give my children opportunities I can't afford. I love you because you see potential in a small-town repair shop owner. I love you because you make my children laugh. I love you because you've shown me that healing is possible even when you think your heart is permanently broken." Tears were flowing freely down Alexandra's cheeks now, but she made no move to wipe them away. "The timing is terrible. It looks like we're only doing this to fight Margaret's challenge. Maybe, but maybe Margaret's challenge is just forcing us to be honest about what we want sooner than we might have otherwise." Daniel released one of her hands to touch her face. "Do you want to marry me, Alexandra? Not for legal reasons or strategic purposes, but because you can imagine building a life together." "Yes," she whispered. "God help me, yes." They held each other in the garden for a long moment, surrounded by the last blooms of autumn and the promise of seasons to come. When they finally separated, Alexandra's expression had lost its brittle defensiveness, replaced by something that looked like hope mixed with determination. "We need to tell the children," she said practically. and we need to do it before the court hearing. They're going to have questions. They're going to have opinions, Alexandra corrected with a slight smile. Sophia especially. She's going to want to know every detail about wedding plans and what it means for their living situation. That afternoon, they gathered in the villa's library, the same room where Daniel had first seen Alexandra watching storm damage threaten her husband's archives. Sophia and Leo sat cross-legged on the Persian rug while Daniel and Alexandra occupied the leather chairs, creating an informal circle that felt more like a family meeting than a formal announcement. "We have something important to discuss with you both," Daniel began, then found himself uncertain how to continue. Sophia immediately perked up with interest. "Are we in trouble?" "No, sweetheart, but we need to make some decisions about our family's future." Daniel looked at Alexandra, drawing strength from her encouraging nod. "You know that Dr. Pierce and I have become very close friends over the past few weeks." "You mean you love each other," Sophia said matter-of-factly. "We figured that out already." Leo nodded sagely. "You get the same look Mom used to get when she talked about Dad." Daniel felt his throat tighten at the unexpected mention of Elena. "You remember that?" "I remember lots of things about Mom," Leo said quietly. "She used to say that love was the most important thing in a family, even more important than being related by blood." Alexandra leaned forward in her chair. "What would you think if your dad and I decided to get married?" The question hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds before Sophia launched herself from the rug into Alexandra's lap, wrapping her arms around the startled woman's neck. "Does that mean we get to live in the castle?" Sophia asked, her voice muffled against Alexandra's shoulder. "If that's what everyone wants," Alexandra replied, automatically adjusting to accommodate the enthusiastic 10-year-old in her arms. Leo was more reserved but equally pleased. "Would you be our stepmom? Like in the fairy tales, but not evil?" "I would be honored to be your stepmom," Alexandra said seriously. "Though I should warn you, I've never been a mother before. I'll probably make mistakes." "Everyone makes mistakes," Leo said, with the wisdom of someone who'd learned to be philosophical about adult imperfections. "Dad burns dinner sometimes, and Mom used to forget to sign our permission slips, but they loved us anyway." "The most important thing," Sophia added, settling more comfortably in Alexandra's lap, "is that you don't disappear. Adults disappear sometimes, and it makes kids feel scared." Alexandra felt her heart break a little at the casual way Sophia mentioned adult disappearance, understanding that both children carried scars from losing their mother at such young ages. "I promise I won't disappear," she said firmly. "Whatever happens with my family or the company or anything else, I will always be here for you and your father." "Good," Sophia said with satisfaction, "because I already picked out my room upstairs, and Leo found a perfect spot in the garden for his robot experiments." Daniel laughed despite the emotional weight of the conversation. "You two have been planning this for a while, haven't you?" "We hoped," Leo admitted. "You've been happier since we started coming here. And Dr. Pierce smiles more now, too." "There's something else you need to know," Alexandra said, gently shifting Sophia so she could look at both children. "My late husband's mother doesn't approve of my friendship with your father. She's trying to use the courts to cause problems for us." Sophia's expression grew fierce. "That's not fair. She doesn't even know Dad." "You're right, it's not fair. But it means we might have to get married sooner than we originally planned, and there might be some difficult times ahead while we work everything out." "How soon?" Leo asked practically. Daniel and Alexandra exchanged glances. "This week," Daniel said, "before the court hearing on Friday." "This week?" Sophia's excitement was immediate and vocal. "Can I help plan the wedding? Can we have flowers? What about a cake?" "It will be a very small ceremony," Alexandra warned. "Just us and a few close friends. Nothing fancy." "I don't care about fancy," Sophia declared. "I care about family." As the afternoon wore on, they discussed practical matters, living arrangements, school logistics, the children's belongings, and how to explain the situation to friends and teachers. Through it all, Daniel found himself marveling at how naturally the 4 of them functioned as a unit, how easily the children accepted the idea of their expanded family, and how right it felt to be planning a future that included all of them. That evening, after the children had been settled in their guest rooms with promises of wedding planning discussions the next day, Daniel and Alexandra sat in the library, sorting through the practical details of merging their lives. "I should probably quit the repair shop," Daniel said, reviewing a list of tasks that seemed to grow longer by the hour. If I'm going to be involved with Pierce Medical, I can't maintain a competing business. Actually, I've been thinking about that. Alexandra looked up from the notebook where she'd been sketching ideas for a simple wedding ceremony. What if instead of quitting, you expanded? The company has been looking for a partner to manage our rural clinic maintenance program. Your shop could be the foundation for something much larger. Daniel considered this, intrigued despite his exhaustion. You mean turn Reyes Medical Equipment Repair into a division of Pierce Medical? I mean give you the resources to do what you're already doing, but on a scale that could help thousands of patients instead of hundreds. Alexandra's eyes lit up with the same strategic brilliance that had once helped build a medical empire. You understand the practical needs of small hospitals and rural clinics better than anyone. What if we created a non-profit subsidiary focused specifically on maintaining medical equipment in underserved areas? You're serious about this? Completely serious. Michael always believed that the best business partnerships were built on complementary strengths rather than similar backgrounds. Alexandra reached for his hand. You bring integrity, community connections, and practical expertise. I bring resources, strategic planning, and corporate experience. Together, we could build something that actually changes lives. Daniel felt something shift in his chest. Not just love for the woman beside him, but genuine excitement about the possibility of meaningful work that went beyond simple survival. For the first time since Elena's death, he could envision a future that was about more than just getting through each day. When you put it like that, he said, bringing her hand to his lips, how could I possibly say no? As they finalized plans for their hasty wedding and began sketching the outlines of their shared professional future, both Daniel and Alexandra understood that they were crossing a threshold from which there would be no retreat. By week's end, they would be married, committed not just to each other but to a vision of family and purpose that neither could have imagined just months before. The legal battles with Margaret would continue, and the corporate politics would remain complex, but they would face those challenges together, as partners, as parents, and as two people who had discovered that the strongest foundations are built not on wealth or status, but on love that's tested by adversity and proven stronger than fear. Friday morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of autumn weather that seemed to match the gravity of what lay ahead. Daniel stood before the bathroom mirror in his small cottage, adjusting the tie he'd worn to Elena's funeral, the only formal clothing he owned that seemed appropriate for both a wedding and a court hearing. His hands were steadier than he'd expected, though his stomach churned with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. "Dad, you look really good," Sophia said from the doorway, wearing the navy blue dress they'd hastily purchased 2 days earlier. Like a dad in a movie who's about to do something important. "I feel like a dad who's about to do something terrifying," Daniel admitted, smoothing his hair one final time. Leo appeared beside his sister, wearing his best khakis and the button-down shirt that Elena had bought him for school pictures the year before she died. "Are you scared?" he asked with his characteristic directness. "A little," Daniel said honestly, "but sometimes the most important things we do are scary." The plan was elegantly simple, born of necessity and Alexandra's strategic mind. They would marry first thing in the morning at the Seaforth Bay courthouse, then drive directly to Boston for the afternoon hearing, where Margaret's lawyers would argue for Alexandra's removal as trustee. The timing was designed to present the court with a fait accompli, a stable marriage that undermined the central premise of Margaret's challenge. At the courthouse, they found Alexandra waiting in the lobby with Lydia and Pastor Miguel, who had agreed to officiate despite the unconventional circumstances. Alexandra wore a simple cream-colored dress and carried a small bouquet of white roses from the villa's garden. She looked nervous but radiant, her dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon that somehow made her appear both sophisticated and approachable. "You look beautiful," Daniel said, taking her hands and feeling some of his anxiety ease at her touch. "You clean up pretty well yourself," Alexandra replied, straightening his tie with the familiarity of someone who'd already begun thinking of him as her husband. Judge Patricia Reeves, a friend of Pastor Miguel's from the church council, had agreed to perform the civil ceremony in her chambers before regular court business began. The room was small and practical, furnished with law books and family photos, but Sophia had insisted on bringing flowers from the villa's garden, and their fragrance filled the space with unexpected beauty. "This is highly irregular," Judge Reeves said with a smile that belied her formal words. but Pastor Miguel assures me that you're not fleeing from the law or trying to commit immigration fraud. Just trying to build a family, Daniel replied, glancing at Sophia and Leo, who stood on either side of them as witnesses. The ceremony itself was brief but surprisingly moving. Judge Reeves had clearly put thought into her words, speaking about the courage required to choose love after loss, and the particular strength needed to blend families across different backgrounds. When she asked for the rings, Daniel produced the simple gold bands they'd purchased the day before. Nothing elaborate, but symbols of the commitment they were making. Daniel, do you take Alexandra to be your wife, to love and support her through whatever challenges life may bring? I do, Daniel said, slipping the ring onto Alexandra's finger and meaning it with every fiber of his being. Alexandra, do you take Daniel to be your husband, to love and support him and his children as you build a life together? I do, Alexandra replied, her voice steady and sure as she placed Daniel's ring on his finger. Then, by the power vested in me by the state of Maine, I pronounce you husband and wife. Judge Reeves smiled broadly. You may kiss your bride. The kiss was gentle and brief, appropriate for the formal setting in the presence of the children, but it carried all the weight of promises made and futures chosen. When they separated, Daniel saw tears in Alexandra's eyes and felt his own throat tighten with emotion. Are we really married now? Sophia asked, bouncing on her toes with excitement. Really and truly, Alexandra confirmed, kneeling to hug both children. We're officially a family. The drive to Boston took 2 hours, giving them time to decompress from the morning's ceremony and prepare for the afternoon's legal battle. Daniel drove while Alexandra reviewed documents with Lydia, and the children entertained themselves with books and travel games. It felt surreal, beginning the day as newlyweds and ending it in a courtroom defending their right to be together. The Suffolk County Courthouse was an imposing granite building that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Margaret Pierce waited in the hallway outside the courtroom, flanked by 2 expensive-looking lawyers, and projecting the kind of confidence that came from decades of getting her way. When she saw Daniel and Alexandra approaching with the children, her expression hardened. Alexandra, dear, Margaret said, her voice carrying the particular venom that some people reserved for family members who disappointed them. How lovely that you've brought your new husband to meet the court. Margaret, Alexandra replied evenly, positioning herself slightly in front of Sophia and Leo. I see you've brought reinforcements. I've brought people who understand the importance of protecting Michael's legacy from unfortunate influences. Margaret's gaze swept over Daniel with undisguised disdain. I hope you'll understand that nothing personal is intended, Mr. Reyes. This is simply business. Mrs. Pierce, Daniel replied with quiet dignity. In my experience, when people say something isn't personal, it usually means it's entirely personal. Margaret's lawyer intervened before she could respond, ushering their party into a conference room for final preparations. Daniel found himself sitting beside Alexandra at a polished table, while lawyers discussed legal strategies in language that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. The marriage this morning was a smart move, Alexandra's lawyer David Chen said quietly. It significantly undermines their argument about emotional instability, but we should be prepared for them to argue that the timing proves the marriage was purely strategic. Let them argue that, Alexandra said firmly. Anyone who spent 5 minutes with Daniel and me together can see that this isn't a business arrangement. The hearing itself was less dramatic than Daniel had expected. Margaret's lawyers presented their case methodically, arguing that Alexandra's withdrawal from active company management, combined with her impulsive personal decisions, demonstrated unfitness to control charitable assets worth tens of millions of dollars. They painted a picture of a grieving widow whose judgment had been compromised by isolation and questionable new relationships. Alexandra's legal team responded by documenting her continued oversight of charitable operations, her strategic input on major company decisions, and the stability represented by her marriage to a respected community member with his own business and strong local ties. They presented testimonials from hospital administrators and clinic directors who had benefited from the Pierce Medical Foundation's rural healthcare initiatives, demonstrating Alexandra's continued effectiveness as a trustee. The turning point came when Judge Harrison asked to speak with Daniel directly. Mr. Reyes, you understand that your wife controls assets worth approximately $150 million? Yes, Your Honor. And you understand that some people might question your motivations in marrying someone with such substantial wealth. Daniel stood slowly, feeling the weight of the courtroom's attention. Your Honor, 6 months ago I was a widowed father struggling to keep his small business afloat, and his children fed and clothed. I had no idea that repairing a storm-damaged roof would lead to marriage, or that I'd find myself in a courtroom defending the woman I love. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But I've learned something important these past months. Real wealth isn't measured in dollars or stock portfolios. Real wealth is having someone who loves your children as much as you do. Real wealth is finding a partner who shares your values and your vision for making the world a little better. Real wealth is building something together that's stronger than what either of you could create alone. Daniel looked directly at Margaret Pierce. Your son built something remarkable. A company that saves lives, and a foundation that provides health care to people who might otherwise go without. Alexandra has protected and grown that legacy for 5 years. If you think marrying me compromises her ability to continue that work, then you don't understand either your daughter-in-law or your son's values. The courtroom was silent for a long moment. Then Judge Harrison nodded slowly. Mrs. Pierce, he said, addressing Margaret, your concerns about family assets are understandable, but the evidence presented doesn't support a finding of unfitness. Dr. Pierce has demonstrated continued competence in managing charitable operations, and her marriage appears to provide additional stability rather than creating risk. He turned to Alexandra. Dr. Pierce, this court recognizes your continued authority as trustee of the Pierce Medical Foundation. However, I strongly encourage you to resume more active participation in company governance to avoid future challenges. Margaret's face was stone as the judge dismissed the case, but she approached Daniel and Alexandra as they gathered their documents. This isn't over, she said quietly. The board still has questions about your leadership, Alexandra. Then I'll answer them, Alexandra replied calmly. At the next board meeting, which I'll be attending for the first time in 2 years. Margaret studied her daughter-in-law for a long moment, then surprised everyone by offering the ghost of a smile. Michael always said you were formidable when cornered. Perhaps he was right. As they left the courthouse, Daniel felt the weight of the day settling over him like a heavy blanket. In the span of 12 hours, he'd gotten married, defended his motives in open court, and committed to a future that would involve corporate boardrooms and legal challenges he'd never imagined facing. Second thoughts? Alexandra asked quietly as they walked toward the parking garage. Daniel looked at her, his wife, he realized with a start, and then at Sophia and Leo, who were discussing wedding cake options with Lydia, as if the day's legal drama had been merely an interesting diversion. Not one, he said firmly, though I think I need to buy some better suits. Alexandra laughed, the first genuinely relaxed sound she'd made all day. I think we can manage that, among other things. As they drove back towards Seaforth Bay through the gathering dusk, Daniel reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, he'd been a man simply trying to survive each day with his children's happiness intact. Now he was married to a brilliant, wealthy woman who saw potential in his small-town dreams and wanted to build something meaningful together. The road ahead would be complicated: corporate politics, family tensions, the challenge of merging two very different worlds. But for the first time since Elena's death, Daniel felt equipped to handle whatever came next. He had a partner now, someone who understood both loss and hope, someone who loved his children and believed in his dreams. Most importantly, he had proof that sometimes the strongest foundations are built not on careful planning or perfect timing, but on the courage to say yes when love offers you a second chance at happiness. 6 months later, the Pierce villa hummed with the kind of purposeful energy that comes from a house truly lived in. Daniel stood at the kitchen window, watching Sophia teach Alexandra's niece Emma how to identify edible plants in the herb garden, while Leo explained his latest robotics project to Alexandra's nephew James. The sound of children's laughter drifted through the open windows, mixing with the rhythmic tap-tap of Alexandra's laptop keys from the library, where she was reviewing proposals for the newest rural clinic partnership. The Reyes Medical Outreach Program had exceeded everyone's expectations. What had started as Daniel's idea to expand equipment maintenance services had grown into a comprehensive rural healthcare support system. Pierce Medical now operated mobile repair units across 3 states, providing free maintenance and emergency services to hospitals and clinics that couldn't afford commercial contracts. Daniel split his time between hands-on fieldwork and strategic planning, traveling to remote communities where his practical experience and Alexandra's resources were changing lives in ways both small and profound. "Dad, come look at this," Sophia called from the garden. She'd discovered her talent for botanical illustration during their first weeks at the villa, and now her detailed drawings documented every medicinal plant in Alexandra's extensive herb collection. "In a minute, sweetheart," Daniel replied, putting the finishing touches on the window frame he'd been repairing. Even in their grand new home, he found peace in the familiar rhythm of maintenance work, the satisfaction of fixing things with his hands. The villa itself had been transformed from a monument to grief into a true family home. Dust covers had been permanently removed, revealing rooms filled with comfortable furniture and children's artwork. The formal dining room now hosted homework sessions and board game tournaments. The vast library had become a combination study hall and reading nook, where all 4 children could be found most evenings, sprawled across Persian rugs with books and projects. "How's the annual report coming?" Daniel asked as he joined Alexandra in the library, settling into the chair that had become his usual spot during her evening work sessions. "Better than I expected," Alexandra replied, pulling off her reading glasses and stretching. "The board was initially skeptical about our rural outreach expansion, but the numbers don't lie. We've serviced over 200 facilities this year, and patient outcomes have improved measurably in communities where we provide regular maintenance." Margaret Pierce's relationship with them had evolved into something resembling respectful coexistence. She remained skeptical of Daniel's background but couldn't argue with the program's results or the stability their marriage had brought to Alexandra's life. At the most recent board meeting, she'd actually praised the quote-to-corporate social responsibility that their partnership had created. "Margaret called this afternoon," Alexandra continued, a hint of amusement in her voice. "She wants to discuss expanding the program into the Midwest. Apparently her country club friends have been impressed by the foundation's work." Daniel laughed. "6 months ago she thought I was a gold digger. Now I'm a strategic asset." "Now you're my husband," Alexandra corrected, moving from her desk chair to curl up beside him in the oversized reading chair they'd learned to share. "And the father of our children. Everything else is just details." Through the window they could see the lights of Seaforth Bay twinkling below, the same view that had once represented isolation now offering a sense of connection to the community they served. Pastor Miguel's blessing at their small wedding reception had proven prophetic. Love had indeed multiplied rather than diminished, creating a family that honored both their past losses and their present joy. "Do you ever miss it?" Alexandra asked quietly. "The simplicity of your old life?" Daniel considered the question, thinking about the man he'd been 6 months ago, struggling to keep his small shop afloat, worried about providing for his children, going through the motions of survival rather than truly living. "I miss the quiet sometimes," he admitted, "but I wouldn't trade this for anything. We're building something that matters, Alexandra, together." She smiled and settled more comfortably against his shoulder. "The strongest foundation." Outside, their children's voices carried on the evening breeze, planning tomorrow's adventures with the confidence of kids who knew they were loved and secure. Inside, Daniel and Alexandra sat surrounded by books and blueprints, and the comfortable clutter of a life fully lived, grateful for the storm that had brought them together and the love that had proved stronger than fear. The future stretched ahead of them, filled with possibilities neither could have imagined alone. More clinics to serve, more children to raise, more ways to heal the world one repair at a time. And at the center of it all, the unshakable truth that the greatest inheritances aren't measured in money, but in the lives you choose to build together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.